Let me introduce myself. I'm Olga Mayorova. I'm from Slavic department. I am my main realm of my main area of research is Russian literature and Russian intellectual history, Russian cultural history, and I recently published a book on Russia entitled "From the Shadow of Empire" about the nexus, Russian nation empire nexus, and how it was understood, perceived, recast by various Russian nationalists, or to put it broadly, intellectuals of the 19th century. And now I'm shifting to another project that deals with Russian perception of Central Asia. And when I began to work on that, I realized that first I need to understand how Russians perceived the East, Asia as a whole. That's what gave a kind of gave an impetus to this particular talk. But before I talk about Russia, the East, how they and this nexus, I would like to remind you about two exciting events that would happen in Greece recently. Soon, Nicole, please.
We just wanted to let you know that the annual Copernicus lecture will take place next Thursday, September 22nd in the evening. It's at Rackham Auditorium. It's a retrospective of the life of Czesław Miłosz, starting with a film and then a symposium, which is going to be a conversation with Robert Haas, Robert Pinsky, Lillian Valet, and also Bogdana Carpenter and Benjamin Paloff. And then also our next Crease Noon lecture is 2 weeks from today, featuring Jane Burbank. And for information about all of our events, we have calendars over there and flyers. And if you're not already on our mailing list, you can find a form to sign up there as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. And we are, of course, excited about John Burbank coming back. She's our former colleague, and she just recently, she and Fred Cooper recently published a book on empire, and we will be discussing it, and she will be talking about that. So back to the East. How Russians perceive Asia and how they define themselves with regard to the East-West dichotomy is the topic that always intrigued scholars. The very position of the Romanov and later Soviet Empire between and within Europe and Asia, not only in terms of geography, of course. Very interesting. Not only in terms of geography, but also, most importantly, in terms of cultural orientation, has made it a central issue of the debate concerning Russian national identity. As most scholars agree, Russian educated society, a product of Peter the Great's westernizing reform, learned to look at the East through European eyes. From the 18th century onward, Russian philosophers, poets, painters, they borrowed Western stereotypes of the East, embracing both ends of the evaluative spectrum, and a fascination with the Orient, with the exotic, picturesque Orient, and condemnation of what was conventionally labeled as Asiatic despotism, stagnation, and backwardness. But how could Russians feel comfortable, completely comfortable, with Western discourse of superiority over Asia, knowing that in Western eyes, Russia itself belonged to the Orient? Then, too, as the Romanov Empire expanded into the Caucasus and to Central Asia, the empire-building process naturally gave rise to more complex responses to questions of Russian self-definition with regard to the East. As Russian explorers, travelers, educators, and bureaucrats came into direct contact with Kazakhs, Bashkirs, Turkmen, the standard European notion of the empire civilizing mission began to strike them as problematic. Of course, Russian state institutions, culture, modern technologies were seen as superior to those of Asia. But the Russian people, as many observed, displayed deep affinities with their Eastern neighbors and were themselves not civilized enough. But despite these challenges, the mainstream of Russia's intellectual discourse, as all scholars concur, functioned within the framework of Western stereotypes of the Orient, with some occasional deviations until the turn of the 20th century, when, under the influence of two religious philosophers, Konstantin Leontiev and Vladimir Solovyov, a more ambivalent vision of the East emerged. The most prominent symbolists and futurists poets, Blok, Bely, and Velimir Khlebnikov after them, ushered in a new understanding of Asia and began to cherish Russia's unique, though traumatic, ties with its eastern neighbors as the source of the nation's true identity, future glory, and the fulfillment of its historical mission. Today, I will try to show, however, that very articulate efforts to depart from the Western paradigm had taken shape in Russian intellectual discourse much earlier. This alternative perspective can be traced back to the middle of the 19th century, when Alexander Herzen, a revolutionary emigre and overwhelmingly popular political writer, issued his scathing criticism of European civilization and began to dismantle the conventional East-West binary in order to elaborate a non-European, or rather anti-European, discourse of Asia. Herzen contributed so profoundly to the formation of the mentality of the intelligentsia that his efforts to reconceptualize the East deserve detailed attention. If any one person could be said to have set the agenda for Russian mid-19th century intellectual discourse, it was Herzen, a classic of Russian autobiography, a key contributor to philosophical discussions of the 40s, an early Russian socialist and a passionate advocate of political freedom. He took it as his mission to undermine the regime and flooded all literate Russia, from the Winter Palace to the secondary schools in Russia provincial towns, with his subversive writings and periodical publications. Herzen's vision of Asia evolved over the years. As I hope to show, his shifting vision of Asia offers an insight into the complex dynamic of Russia's perception of its eastern neighbors. And this dynamic developed in response to the basic ambiguity of the empire-nation nexus in Russia, a country in which it is difficult to draw precise boundaries between the metropolis and the colonies, and it is often unclear where the titular people ends and the subject people begin. By the time Herzen emerged on the literary scene, two major modes of depicting the East were already well established in Russia. From the reign of Catherine the Great well into the 19th century, satirists juxtapose Russian regime with that of China and Persia in order to attack Russian despotism and reveal the shortcomings of their own country. And of course, they all read Montesquieu's Persian letters and knew the tradition that built on that. As for the second mode of perceiving the Orient, it was also during Catherine's reign that Russian aristocrats began to share in Enlightenment Europe's passion for the exotic and admiration for the Orient. Russia's fascination with the Orient increased with the conquest of the Caucasus and with the ascent of Romantic poetry, which portrays the East as a locus of fantasy, wisdom, heroism, passion, and even freedom. And of course, the second trend was developed under the influence of German and English Romantic poetry that inspired Russians to see the Orient this way. But still, it was the different realm. It was the other. for the Russians. In the 30s and the 40s, as Russian philosophy of history was taking shape, two groups of thinkers appeared, the Westernizers and the Slavophiles. The Westernizers took Russia's European identity for granted. They emphatically demarcated Russia from Asia and embraced the Western notion of the Orient as Europe's other, a realm of despotism, stagnation, indolence, religious fanaticism. Meanwhile, the Slavophiles, determined opponents of the Westernizers, fostered anti-European sentiments and defined Russian national identity through the Byzantium Orthodoxy and Slavic indigenous culture. But despite their paramount disagreements with the Westernizers, the Slavophiles embraced the same conventional assumption of Russia's superiority over the East and carefully avoided identifying their country as part of the Orient. As a confirmed Westernizer, Herzen accepted the emphatically negative image of the East. And although he never tired of underscoring the Asian component of Russia's true self, for him the affinity with the East signaled Russia backwardness and the cruelty of the regime. Yet after Herzen immigrated to Western Europe, his entire intellectual agenda and his understanding of Russia-Asian encounter underwent profound changes. As for his political views, he moved from hope for the coming victory of socialism in Europe to complete disappointment in the revolutionary potential of most developed states, France and England, which in his eyes had previously incarnated progress. This disillusionment began as he watched the abortive revolutionary wave of 1848. And in the years to come, Herzen became increasingly frustrated with the Europe that survived the crash and lived through the reactionary backlash that followed. Europe, he claimed, had traded liberal values for bourgeois well-being and for pursuit of material wealth. He observed with horror that the French preferred a strong centralist state and interventionist government to a republic, and the French state reminded him of Russian despotic regime. For him, this development not only posed a corrosive threat to society, but revealed Europe's incurable sickness inherent in its history and institutions. So for him, no nostrum could be found in Europe to protect its own achievements. Now, Herzen pins his hopes on the Russians. He declared the Russian peasant commune, an authentic institution of Slavic society, to be the natural kernel of socialism that would allow Russia to implement its unique historical mission. And the commune had the potential, from his point of view, to develop organically into an institution that would combine social justice and economic success. And with its natural predisposition towards socialism, Russia would be able to transform itself, he claimed, and ultimately to transform the rest of the world by developing the new social order. This shift in Herzen's views is well known, and I'm not going to dwell upon it here. What has thus far eluded scholars, however, is the fact that simultaneously with this radical reevaluation of the West and the ascent of his belief in Russian socialism, another critically important development was unfolding in Herzen's writing. The conventional construct of Asia took on a striking ambiguity, and he became increasingly, if inconsistently, to question the customary divide between East and West. Herzen began attributing to Europe the same derogatory features that were conventionally assigned to Asia. Two examples. France, for example, was whose interventionist government and colonial ambitions had, in Herzen's opinion, betrayed the principle of liberty, these France had the potential to become a despotic state of the Oriental type. It could, in Herzen's words, settle into the beautiful martial channel of Persian life. And of course, beautiful is irony. Herzen admitted, of course, that France differed from its Oriental prototype in that it made use of modern technologies, telegraphs, railroads, but France did so only to more effectively shackle other peoples to the fortunes of its centralized despotism. Herzen also assigned some Oriental features to England. As English contemporary society made plain, Herzen observed, the oppressive hand of custom stifles development. Because it was driven only by custom and the hunger for personal gain, England could easily turn into another China. One can find such diatribes against the West scattered throughout Herzen's work during his emigre period. All of the above quotations, however, are taken from one short essay that Herzen published in 1859 in immediate and enthusiastic response to John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. Neither review nor polemical article, the essay, as it seems at first glance, was designed with the modest goal of acquainting the Russian public with the ideas of a widely acclaimed English thinker. Indeed, Herzen was thrilled by Mill's attack on the despotism and public opinion and custom and people's predisposition to uniformity and conformity. In modern Europe, Mill states, as government control over the individual gradually wanes, the tyranny of the public opinion grows exponentially. In Mill's picture of how public opinion works to suppress popular singularity and how popular sovereignty limits individual sovereignty, Herzen recognized a confirmation of his own critique of bourgeois Europe. Though the two thinkers partially converged in their judgments of Europe, there were a profound contrariety in their views. While Mill believes that the yoke of conformity and the tyranny of the majority are not inherent traits of European democracies and can be overcome, Herzen renders these features the essence of Western civilization and labels them in incurable pathology. I think Herzen's essay translated the rationalistic argument of a British utilitarian into the eschatological scheme of a Russian socialist. The difference between the two thinkers emerges most sharply when analogies with Asia arise. Both drew parallels with the East to condemn modern Europe. Herzen even borrowed his phrase, Europe will tend to become another China, from Mill. But Herzen uses this phrase to call into question the conventional understanding of the East-West nexus. While for Mill, Europe has not become a China and can still rescue itself by allowing each individual to exercise more liberty. Herzen claims that Western countries are already doomed to Asiatic decay. Herzen raises the parallels with Asia 6 times in his 10-page response to Mill, while Mill uses it only once in his more than 100 pages essay. And finally, what is most important, Mill inscribes his vision of the West-East dichotomy within a strict civilizational hierarchy. The principle of liberty that he defends apply only to what he calls a civilized community. For the East, as well as for societies of the past, Mill justifies and even prescribes despotism. Herzen is clearly uneasy with the conventional divide between civilized West and backward East. without explicitly contradicting Mill, and he tried to smooth over their contradictions. He protests against the common practice of describing the deterioration of Europe through comparison with the Orient. If you want to understand the decay of Europe, he claims, there is no need to go as far as China. Just take a look at Holland. Holland, for Herzen, is a country with a heroic past that has stalled completely in its development. It has become remarkable in Herzen's eyes as only for its what he calls creatures' comforts, выглаженный comfort, and placidity. After such an assertion, there remains but a single step to come to the defense of Asia, and Herzen takes it at the very conclusion of his essay, when he suddenly exclaims, "To tell the truth, I do not know how it is that China and Persia may be insulted with impunity." Thus, in contrast to Mill, Herzen begins to question the European discourse of superiority, but at the same time, quite paradoxically, he does not fully exclude such idioms from his own writing. This paradox reflects the ambiguous position in which he found himself. On the one hand, he lived in Europe, he felt all Europe ideas and problems as his own. He subscribed to many ideological trends. On the other hand, deeply disillusioned with Europe as a prime mover of liberty, he became increasingly frustrated with Europe's assumptions about the rest of the world. And it's clear that Herzen's effort to reconceptualize the East was driven by his growing skepticism regarding the West-East binary. In the 50s and the 60s, he proposed that the historical role of the Asian peoples might not be entirely negative. And to prove his thesis, he shifted his focus from China and Persia, customary emblems of the Orient in European discourse, to Russia's own Orient, and embarked on a re-evaluation of the entire trajectory of Russian history. He began to align the Russians with non-Slavic peoples of the Romanov Empire and placed these combined masses on a low rung of the civilizational ladder. In this way, Herzen accepted Russians' backwardness, but began to claim that despite their backwardness, or rather because of their backwardness, Russians and other peoples of the empire represented a historical force that would transform the world. And that's how his vision of barbarism developed. Barbarism, dimension of Russian socialism. He drew parallels between the degradation of contemporary Europe and the twilight of the Roman Empire. In the first centuries of the Common Era, savage tribes conquered the cultures and educated but depraved Romans, and at that point the stream of history carved a new channel. Young and energetic barbarians took the fate of Europe in their hands, while the Christians, who only had been hiding in the catacombs, offered Europe a new mission. Now, Herzen prophesizes a similar profound change awaits Europe. As Herzen states, sensitive people already hear the approach of the new barbarians marching to destroy and the new Christians marching to build. In his revolutionary teleology, barbarians signifies non-European peoples, and the role of Christianity passes to socialism. Herzen's belief that it could only be Russia, or more precisely, its mighty and sphinx-like people, that would change the course of history. And he supported this claim by referring to Russians' freshness of youth and natural inclination towards socialist institutions, of course, the peasant commune. Not surprisingly, during his long immigrant years, Herzen proudly refers to himself personally, and there are lots of references like that in his memoirs, and to Russians in general as barbarians. He thus redeployed the theme of Russian backwardness, always viewed as a source of shame, using it to cast barbarians and barbarism as a boon. But how were the Russians to preserve their barbarism while living in Western Europe? And Herzen's answer was interesting. He claimed that Peter the Great reforms, brought the break in Russian history. The break in our history caused by Peter has brought about a fundamental discontinuity in our memories of the violence of the state against the individual. So our reminiscences go no further than the manor house where we were wiped and the barracks where we were beaten with rods. Herzen thus created a mythology of emptiness, and it is precisely this mythology that helps him to refashion Russians as barbarians charged with a profound historical mission. Because they have been deprived of the past and of historical memories, Russians are more dynamic, mobile, and younger than Europeans. And Herzen joyfully exclaims, "What good fortune that the Russian Empire is such a monstrous state." So if for English liberals, including John Mill, the British Empire was a powerful engine of progress that was modernizing the subjugated societies, for Herzen, the Romanov Empire was the instrument of oppression, deprivation, and retardation of its own peoples. And in this way, paradoxically, it played a progressive role in history. In this way, the Russian Empire was a mighty reserve of barbarous energy that, once driven by socialist ideas, would have the power to remake the world. The question is, what is the role of the East in this construct? Herzen began to claim that if Peter tore Russia away from its past, the Mongols tore it away from Europe. This latter statement about the Mongols is a central axiom of the Russian historical narrative. It always presented the Mongol yoke as Russia's principal historical trauma that isolated it from Europe. Herzen, however, reassesses this stereotype. It's not the greatest. Is it not the greatest good fortune that we drew closer to Europe so late, that is only with reforms of Peter the Great, he exclaims? After all, if Russia had not been conquered by the Mongols, but had instead been thoroughly westernized, it would now be perishing on the sinking ship of Europe. He then goes on to make the most shocking and the most stunning declaration. Herzen welcomes the Mongol conquest and indeed the whole set of Russian painful military encounters with Asiatic people. We may yet find ourselves obliged to bless the Chud and Turanian elements that stunted our ancient Slavic past, just as we now bless the disruption visited upon us by Peter. Chud was a conventional name for the Finno-Ugric peoples, Turanian for the Turkic peoples. Herzen here transforms the image of a pernicious Asia, cursed by many generations of Russian intellectuals, into a protective shield that saved Russia from the West and thus saved it from untimely death. In the 19th century, Russia, the Mongol yoke, was considered the main nation's historical trauma. Not the only, of course, but the main. But also, it was considered the source of a destructive political legacy that left an imprint of Oriental despotism on Russian rulers. Many writers, including Herzen himself, draw on and perpetuated this stereotype. Yet, when he discovered the positive potential of barbarism, he shifted his focus from the state to the nation. Or, put it differently, he shifted his focus from the state institutions infected with Oriental despotism and hampering the nation's progress to the people, the masses of mixed origins capable of changing the course of history. In his depiction of these masses, Herzen treated the Russians as the equals of all the subjugated nationalities of the empire. Our proximity to and kinship with the Chudes and Turanian tribes have served to foster humble recognition of them as equals, Jew and Finn, Tatar and Kalmyk. Do we not equally serve as the caryatid supporting the Winter Palace? What right have we looked down upon them from the heights of Western civilization? Thus, for Herzen, the Russians, who are oppressed by the regime no less than the other peoples of their empire, do not represent the colonizer. They are themselves colonized. This conclusion determined Herzen's vision of the empire future. When the Romanov Empire collapsed, and he predicted the collapse of the empire, especially after the Crimean War, the gigantic masonry and the foundation will remain. By gigantic masonry and foundation, he meant not the state institutions destined to perish, but the immeasurable space populated by the various peoples of the empire. The imperial period of Russian history, he declared, created enormous empty forms without content that are still waiting for something to fill them. He not only did not call for the destruction of these forms, he began to defend the right and ability of the Russian people to continue building on the already constructed foundation. Like the Bolsheviks after him, Herzen believed that the Romanov Empire, or its significant part, can survive the collapse of the monarchical regime. Like Eurasianists after him, Herzen proposed a super national state based on Russo-Turanian symbiosis. So in some way he was close to the Bolsheviks, and in some way, the idea that the Russians are the colonized, not the colonizers, and the idea that it would be a supranational state based on a Russo-Turanian symbiosis is pretty close to what the Eurasianists in the 20th century proposed. Although Herzen never fully elaborated on how Russians had converged with the Asiatic peoples of the empire, he believed that over the course of many centuries, these people were molded by the same pressures, basically by the same pressures of the regime, into a unified barbarian mass, lacking a past, full of energy and open to the future. I think we should credit Herzen with the first very articulate construct to propose Russians' ties with their eastern neighbors as a source of the nation's true identity and the fulfillment of its historical mission. Given Herzen's overwhelming popularity among the intelligentsia, it's not surprising that his attempt to reconceptualize the East had broad intellectual repercussions in the second half of the 19th century, and especially in the beginning of the 20th century. Of course, many Russians continued to perpetuate Western cultural stereotypes regarding Asia throughout the 19th century and later. But as Herzen's case suggests, Russian discourse on Asia was complex, dynamic, sophisticated, and sought to break out of the Western paradigm to address the basic challenges of the empire they lived in. That's my main points.